Good afternoon and welcome to the Berean Coffee House. My name is Kevin Short. I am a Christian philosopher of religion, here to discuss faith, life, and a little pop culture, all from within a Christian worldview. Why Berean? Because the Bereans both believed, but they were intellectually curious. Why Coffee House? Because the coffee houses were very important in the spreading of the English Enlightenment, and I hope to provide something of a similar service. Today we're going to talk about how Christians need to examine the F word. Get your mind out of the gutter, not that one. Just kidding. We may perhaps at some point discuss the coarsening of our public language and perhaps more importantly the acceptability of that coarsening. But the F word I have in mind is fundamentalist or fundamentalism. So let's talk. First, I probably should note that I have a bit of personal history here. I may be losing a few friends. Not my goal, but sometimes when you speak truth, there are consequences for that. I grew up in fundamentalism. I was in the Baptist Bible Fellowship as a child, which was the second largest independent fundamentalist Baptist association at the time, possibly the third or fourth largest Baptist organization in the world. Later, I went to Bob Jones University, where I began to associate with those in the FBF, now the FBFI. At that time, it was the Fundamentalist Baptist Fellowship. It became the Foundation's Baptist Fellowship International. Let's not get on the pretension of the international. They're a little too small, I think, for that type of grandeur, but, you know, it is what it is. And then I became a Southern Baptist, which was leaving fundamentalism. And many of you may immediately say, but wait a minute, aren't Southern Baptists fundamentalists? No, they're not. And that is the first thing we need to make sure that we understand about this word fundamentalism. So the word fundamentalism itself has sort of lost any real meaning. The fundamentalism was a movement. And it is a current set of organizations that still claim to be aligned with that movement. But it's a historical thing. And sometimes in some studies or in the press, groups that are not actually associated with the fundamentalist movement get labeled as fundamentalists. In part, I think this involves some cherry picking to try and come to the conclusions one wants to have, particularly with one set of studies I'm thinking of, where I'm fairly sure this was done. I do not believe it is therefore reasonable to describe things like fundamentalist Islam. Islamic fundamentalism, as they call it, has a very different set of interpretational goals, a very separate culture, and is a very separate movement. I once engaged with a relatively kind atheist online who was describing a bizarre group as a fundamentalist group. When I saw it, I asked her if she was sure it was a fundamentalist group. It sounded more like a primitive Baptist group. And she looked into it and said I was right. The fundamentalist movement and the primitive Baptist movement are two completely different things. But it's very easy for them to be combined in the popular imagination. Now, I want to dial into the history just a little bit. I should note I made 3 prior attempts at this video, and I felt like all of them fell apart, and so I don't want to get into history that much, but I do want to state at the beginning, the original idea of fundamentalism was a big tent of evangelical Protestants, as we would call them now, of those who held to traditional doctrines that Protestants have held since the Reformation, and to deal with the coming in of what was at that time called German rationalism or theological liberalism, and a response to that. Some people have labeled this as an anti-intellectual movement. Without getting too far into details, this involves something like the conflict thesis, which is something I will talk about at another time, and we'll have to talk about it another time. But basically, there were a lot of myths that were being used to define religion and those who held to traditional religious views for quite a while. We now know those are historical myths, but that was unknown during the 20s when fundamentalism began. There were also some issues involving philosophy that are a little more obscure to most people. Most American schools up until that point were in a philosophical tradition known as the Scottish common sense realism. The new theology that was coming in, theological liberalism or German rationalism, was built on ideas really as enormously important premises from German idealism. And German idealism was kind of being viewed as the new modern way to do things. And so this tended to get people who didn't line up with Kant to be portrayed as kind of country bumpkins. So originally it was a big tent. Originally it was about preserving the faith in the large denominations. Eventually they felt that they lost that battle and they formed their own smaller groups. There were Fundamentalist Baptists, originally in the Baptist Bible Union, then in the GARBC, the WBF, the BBF, the FBF, the Conservative Baptists, on and on and on, ad infinitum. It fractured into 1,000 little pieces. There were a couple of major Presbyterian organizations, and we can go on down the line of fundamentalist groups that began at this time. But they all tended to get along on the big central issues. And these were the fundamentals of the faith. There is a volume in print called The Fundamentals of the Faith, which is a compilation of Sunday school materials that were circulated by fundamentalists. And you will find that if you read the fundamentals, it does not match the fundamentalism you may see of today. Another point of emphasis were the 5 fundamentals of the Presbyterians, which were used essentially for deciding whether or not somebody should be defrocked, which is the removal of pastoral rights and authorities within their denomination. So it was a big tent. But unfortunately, things change. There was a debate in the National Association of Evangelicals about how Christians should engage with non-believing scholarship, with theological liberals, with Roman Catholics, and this led to a split. Unfortunately, I can't, there's still, this happened in the 50s and 60s, so it's still close enough that unfortunately, when we look at this period of history, we're too concerned to try and figure out who was right, rather than trying to really learn from both sides. Because I don't think either side was completely right. I don't think either side was completely wrong. I still admire some of those fundamentalist leaders from that day. I also admire some of their evangelical counterparts, as strange as that may seem. One of the things, though, that comes about is because fundamentalism had found it necessary to leave the denominations, they had developed this idea of separation. Separation from the world, separation from unbelievers, and they added to this separation from brothers who were not walking rightly according to the Word. Which we do have discussions of this in church discipline in the New Testament. The problem was here, the application. Rather than noting that there were real disagreements, there was a hard and fast separation from evangelicals. And this would become the focus of fundamentalism in my time and apparently even into today. So, there are a few things that I think are legitimate problems in fundamentalism. The first one that everybody knows of is legalism. Fundamentalists are often called Pharisees. Now, I hate to say it, but they're right. I say this as somebody who at one point was a hyper-fundamentalist, and praise the Lord, He rescued me from that. But there is a very distinct rules-based thinking. And in some cases, I fear that the rules become a substitute for the role of the Holy Spirit in the believer's life. I have heard fundamentalists or former fundamentalists or those who attended school with me who have stated in their days in fundamentalism they didn't understand the gospel. They didn't understand it until they left fundamentalism. I can't say that was me. I actually became, while still at Bob Jones University, a bit more loose on these areas and would start my journey away from fundamentalism while there in Galatians, and became a very firm believer in grace while at BJU. And I heard it from the platform from some speakers, not from others. But it does cover up the gospel, and I think that's dangerous. But we'll put a pin in that and hold that with a few other points. Secondly, I think somewhere along the line, the big tent aspect of fundamentalism died. Now, I want to be very cautious because we all have different degrees of association with people, right? So we have people that we may associate with as Christians that are in a different denomination. And it's not necessarily going to work for us to attend the same church. Just as a very real illustration, let's just say there was a Presbyterian church down the road, and they wanted to combine themselves with our Baptist church, which is in the Southern Baptist Convention. At some point, somebody's going to bring a baby up to be washed and call it a baptism, and somebody from my side of the house is going to say nothing doing. Now, I mean no disrespect from my Presbyterian friends, but we have a fundamental disagreement here, and at some point, a church has to have a policy on that issue. So we can't have as close a fellowship in a church setting as we might in many other settings, such as in a university classroom, in a debating club, in fellowship, over coffee. We all understand that we have different degrees of association with believers who have disagreements with us. And at some point, those differences are necessary more for administrative purposes than for anything else. I mean, one believer thinks that we ought to have a congregational-based system of church government. Another believes that we need to have most everything decided by the elders. Hey, that's a great academic debate. I don't really have a huge fight with either of those points of view. But at some point, you got to write a church constitution if you're going to start a church. And if you can't come to an agreement on that issue, it's just not going to work. I mean, that's just old-fashioned horse sense. But fundamentalism didn't tend to recognize that, and rather than taking these distinctives as being places where good men disagree, they started turning them into issues of fundamentals for the faith. Probably the worst example I can think of is within the FBF. I found out many years later, because it was before my time. In the 70s or 80s, they made the declaration that issues involving church music were fundamentals of the faith. I don't... That's crazy. To argue that musical styles are a fundamental of the faith itself, brother, if you go that far, maybe you really don't understand the faith. Maybe there is a far more basic problem, but I digress. I mean, it was literally to that level of insanity when it comes to redefining the fundamentals into these small, narrow boxes. Now, again, that works for a local church. That may work for a denominational body. That may work for a denominational school. But when you're trying to do a larger movement of Christians, that doesn't work. You can't make every issue a doctrinal issue or a hill to die on. And this all ties into the doctrine of separation. Fundamentalism tends to view itself as being more pure than the rest of us. They think that by keeping those rules, God loves them a little more than he does the rest of us. They won't quite say it, but I've been around long enough to know that's kind of the feeling. They are not sinners like those evangelicals who merely cry out and say, God, save me a sinner. Because you see, our doctrine teaches us that God is pleased with us because of the finished work of Jesus Christ, and not because of our deeds. And the life that we live now, we live because he has reinvigorated us, because he has changed us. And we don't do it to earn favor with God. We do it to grow into him. And because we are his child and because we want to well represent him. But the fundamentalist approach to rules, sadly, doesn't always comport with that Christian ideal. But separation would become problematic in many ways. And I've written an article about this. I'll post it in the blog entry down below in our description. But the problem is that there are errors in heresy that come on the left, the theological left, but there are also doctrinal heresies and issues that come up on the theological right. And the response to errors on the left within fundamentalism and the response to errors on the right are very, very different. The best two examples of this are Bill Gothard and Jack Hyles. Now, Bill Gothard is an absolute nut job. I apologize. I cannot find, I was always told if you can't say something nice, don't say anything at all. Bill Gothard is not a guy I know how to say something nice about. He doesn't, his whole view of the Old Testament does not fit the faith. It is heresy. It certainly doesn't fit evangelicalism. He denies, according to the last source I read, the basic elements of justification by grace through faith. There were also sex scandals and possibly SA, considering the age of some of the girls involved with his brother and with him. And some of that, at an earlier date, was covered up. Some of them, sadly, by, or at least allegedly, I've not been able to verify all the details, by those working in the name of my alma mater, Bob Jones University. Then there was Jack Hyles. Among other things, he preached a sermon in which he stated that if somebody dealt with you from a version of the Bible other than the King James, you could be born again. But you were born again of the devil. There comes a point where King James onlyism has to be treated as a heresy, guys. I don't use the H word lightly. But, yeah, that's a problem. He also has some sermons where he seems to imply that God needs man and mankind. And a few other ideas. His sermons don't have a lot of content. When I was really young, I found them exciting in my hyper-fundamentalist days. There's a great deal of energy in them, but not a lot of content. And that appeals to a large base in fundamentalism. There were, besides the doctrinal issues with Jack Hyles, a number, again, of scandals. There were cover-ups of SA, including probably SA committed by his son while he was a youth pastor. At the time, it was not always reported this way, but because the young ladies involved were minors, and a few details that have come out more recently in a lawsuit that was filed against Hyles' son, there is good reason to believe it was extremely serious. And there was also a deacon who was a child molester who was convicted, and yet the church did quite a bit to try and protect him and protect his reputation. And Hyles himself was alleged with very strong evidence to either be involved in an affair with a secretary who was also his was a deacon's wife, as well as or an emotional affair with her. All of this was revealed by a fundamentalist church newspaper. So for some of you younger people who may not understand fundamentalism very well, back in the day you had these things called newspapers, and you had the big ones, but you also had a lot of smaller ones associated with various organizations, and every big fundamentalist leader had some kind of a newspaper that he considered his own, that might have a small readership. And issues involving what was going on in Jack Hyles' church and at the school that he had founded, Hyles Anderson College, when they came out, a lot of fundamentalists didn't attack Jack Hyles. They attack the guy who wrote the newspaper articles. And they remain fundamentalists in good standing. There was no need to separate from those who associated themselves with Jack Hyles. There was never any need to separate from those who associated themselves with Bill Gothard. Although why anybody would associate with him is perhaps a bigger question. Yet, you have to separate from those who associate themselves with John MacArthur if you want to be a fundamentalist in good standing. You might read his books, but that's going to lead, at least in some cases, to some questioning looks. Now, is fundamentalism monolithic? It never has been, although I would say a lot of people are like me. They've, quite frankly, chased out most of the people who have any horse sense, and they have left the movement, and they are gone. So, when it comes to the F word, do we just demonize fundamentalism? Well, if you're listening carefully, I hope you will understand that this is not just a problem that happens in fundamentalism. It happens in other areas of Christianity. It's a part of our humanness. For example, there are groups within Reformed churches associated with Dutch Neo-Calvinism, and I want to be careful, not every Dutch Neo-Calvinist goes this far, but they can be just as bad as the fundamentalists in terms of the way they treat other believers who have minor disagreements. I have heard them describe the Scottish Enlightenment, which was a very Christian thing, by the way, very rooted in the Bible in many ways, and began over a controversy about how to interpret a couple of matters in Presbyterian documents, the Westminster Confession of Faith. They call the Scottish divines compromisers, which is a fundamentalist term. There are some who are moving to Anglicanism and leaving Baptist churches and others, and they somehow view Anglicanism as better because of its doctrinal characteristics in terms of the magisterium. A place where I disagree with them, although I do find church tradition to be very important. That's a topic for another day. But in all of these cases, it's a place where we start trying to make our ideas of what's big central rather than the actual big ideas of the Bible and of the Protestant Reformation. When we start getting too tied up to our own thoughts, when we make the small things big, when we become too rules conscious, and at some point I will have to talk about why I hold to a combination of divine command theory and virtue theory, but I do not believe the Bible. I do not believe Christian ethics comes down to obeying the rules. I believe many situations of Christian ethics, in fact, just simply aren't covered by rules. It's not that we can disobey them. It's just that the number of rules are actually far more limited, and so we have to invent a bunch of them. And when we start inventing them, we're doing exactly what Matthew 7 tells us not to do. There are a lot of things that can lead us in the wrong path of fundamentalism. This also includes anti-intellectualism. That will be a topic for another day. Christian anti-intellectualism has and is a problem. And I will discuss that from C.S. Lewis's point of view at some point in time. But my goal is not just to dog on fundamentalism, but to make sure that we learn from it and that we don't go down the same route. That we understand the importance of mere Christianity. That we respect Christians who might understand a passage a little differently than we do. Why do I say that? Because fundamentalism is dying. Real fundamentalism. The fundamentalist movement. They lost the plot a long time ago. And I believe, at least in terms of the movement as a whole, that Ichabod is written by the door. And that doesn't mean I don't associate with fundamentalists. I don't separate from them. Some of them may want to leave me behind after this. That's okay. But I stay friendly with a number of professors and a number of other people that I admire from my Bob Jones University days. even if administration and I certainly would not see eye to eye on many different things, and I'm certainly in a slightly different camp in certain points of theology and philosophy, which is my major field of study, than the direction they perhaps would prefer for me to go in. I have friends in fundamentalism. I don't stiff on them. But I think as a movement, it's not going to last. God seems to be done with them. There is a pendulum that swings through church history. And when groups grow too big for their britches, when they become too proud and arrogant, when their intellectual pride lifts them up, then God simply moves to another corner of His church, because it's all His church. Do you want to know why Anglicanism is growing and perhaps the Southern Baptists aren't? It has very little to do with the doctrinal distinctives of Anglicanism. It has to do with the fact that some Southern Baptists sadly want to fight about the wrong things. The last thing that I think we need to note on this is that point at which fundamentalists don't even match up to their own self-image. Now, I already noted the belief that fundamentalism is a more pure version of Christianity is false, given the tolerance of Jack Hyles, Bill Gothard, and those who covered up for them. It's rather difficult to say that, connecting yourself with those guys is better somehow than connecting yourself with those who were connected with recently passed John MacArthur. But one of the things fundamentalists also think about themselves is as the defenders of the faith. And I'm going to speak to a couple of friends who may still be watching. If you think as a fundamentalist you're defending the faith, I'm sorry. Fundamentalism has done very, very little in that regard. If you want to learn apologetics, you have to do it from an evangelical, because fundamentalists don't engage, and haven't for a long time. I wanted to write a paper at one point on fundamentalist apologists and their interpretation of a particular passage. I wrote my alma mater, Bob Jones University, for information on the apologetics of one of the founders of the Department of Bible. And they said, well, there were a few notes, but he really didn't do anything on that topic, and we don't have anything preserved. When I went into Christian philosophy and when I went into Christian apologetics, I basically had to unlearn a lot of what I learned at BJU, because those were areas where the school was, unfortunately, rather weak and didn't have what it needed to move forward. There has, in fact, been no important Christian apologist from fundamentalism in at least 50 years. Now, what do I mean by important? I don't mean that they're a big man. I don't mean that they have some big blog or some big leadership. I mean somebody who has actually contributed something, even a paper, that is of some importance in the field. And they haven't done it. Why? Because they'd rather fight about who was right at the evangelical fundamental split 50 years ago. When our movements become about us, when they become about our big men, and when they become about our hobby horses, we lose the plot. And our solution is to make Jesus big, and human beings become a little bit smaller as a result. Thank you for joining me. My name is Kevin Short. This has been the Berean Coffee House. I am available for speaking engagements. I have a discussion on a positive case for Christianity, as well as on the problem of evil. Both of them are extremely packed with information. I do intend to break them down over time. You can reach me here at this channel, or you can reach me at the Berean Coffee House at gmail.com. I hope you have a good day, a good evening, a good night's sleep, and I hope to catch you another time. Thank you. Bye.